What's up, everybody? Happy Monday. How are you? Okay, new week, new Torah. Let's begin with a blessing today. Ends lasok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. To immerse ourselves in words of Torah. We're going to get we're fully immersed today. We're going to get deep in. We're in the Mishnah. We've been studying the highlights of the Mishnah starting at the top. And one of the reasons that I've said this before, that I really want to study the Mishnah with you all is that I think it's just an incredible resource for building the basic information blocks of Judaism. Just like it's just core Jewish knowledge of getting these laws that now make up our tradition. We're getting them as they're just being formulated. And it really is, I would say, there's some schools of thought that one should not study the Talmud until one has been through the entire Mishnah, because after all, it's the first layer. Okay, so that's one of the reasons that I wanted to chart this course with you all. But the other thing about the Mishnah and that makes it such a rich study is that it is not just a straightforward code. And I've said this many times before. If I wanted to just teach Jewish knowledge, if that was the only goal, we would probably go to the Rambam, to Maimonides, who puts it all very clear. These are the laws. That's all there is to it. But the Mishnah is a kind of a code that is being worked out in kind of real time. What you're dipping into is the ancient rabbinic conversation as it was happening. And because of that, we stumble upon in the Mishnah all kinds of curiosities, all kinds of unusual stories, tales, and just sometimes just peculiarities, just oddities, just strange things. And we saw one of them last week. Right? We like ended up last week actually discovering a monster in the midst of this kind of forest of laws. There was if you were with us last week, and if you weren't, check out our recording, because by the end we got to the rabbinic imagination describing a kind of a creature that grew out of the ground. So there's weird stuff in this code, and that, for my money, is part of what makes it so great to learn. We're moving to a new tractate of the Mishnah, and it's an important tractate, the laws of which, that core information, we'll study next week. But today, I want to share with you one of these odd moments, one of these kind of strange, snippets of conversation that recorded from rabbis in the first and second centuries. And as you read through it, if you're reading the Mishnah, if you're like kind of being a good student and trying to learn the Mishnah, you read through it and you're learning all these laws, and all of a sudden you notice something very strange is happening here. And I just couldn't resist. I couldn't not share this with you. I don't know exactly what's going on here. I've never seen this. I've never heard anyone teach a class on this before, and I've never taught a class on it. So this is kind of a new thing for me, and we'll kind of move through as we go. But I think there's something really really big happening here, and part of the point is that it's being concealed. Because something's being hidden, as we'll soon see. Okay, now I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. So let's get into the text. We'll soon see a very strange conversation, and we'll spend the rest of our time trying to figure out exactly what's going on. Okay, so here's just the basic information you need for Masechet Shvi'it. Masechet Shvi'it is the 7th year, Shvi'it, and it is the laws of the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year. If you've been following along, we're in the first body of law in the Mishnah, and that's agricultural law. And one of the great agricultural laws of the Torah is that in the 7th year, the land, it lays fallow, we often say. If you let the land, the fruit of the produce of the land just grow, you don't tend to the produce of the land because, well, that's a whole conversation, but there's some notion that it's like Shabbat. Every 7 years, there will be a Shabbat of the land. The land also has a Shabbat. Now, that's a beautiful concept, but how do you then eat in the 7th year? And the answer is basically that God will provide. I mean, the answer is that in this ancient system, there was faith that in that 7th year, there would be enough abundance of crops and produce that you would actually you would be able to sustain yourself. Okay, the only other thing we need to know before we dive in is there are all these different laws of the sabbatical year. You can't harvest, you can't plow, you can't seed during the sabbatical year. Some interesting stuff. You can't block people to keep them out of your property because everybody has claim to all of the produce of the land. It's really like a deep course of study, Shemitah. But for our purposes, we're going to dig into one particular law towards the end of the tractate. And the law is this, that the produce of the sabbatical year can be consumed, eaten, drunk, and even used for, you can use the product to make oil for your skin. But you can't use the produce for anything else. So you can't sell it and just make money off it. And for our purposes, it's just interesting that it's eating and drinking, sure, but also you can use it for oil on your skin, but we'll soon see the law is going to be that you can't use it for oil for, I don't know, the leather on your seats, okay? So you can use the produce of the sabbatical year for basically the idea is that you have to use it, benefit from it, consume it, but you can't start to turn it into product, commerce. And you can't use it for other reasons, utilitarian purposes. Okay. All right. Now here we go. We're going to dive in and we're going to take a look at one law on that topic, and then we're going to see this strange conversation pop out. So let me give you the source sheet. Okay, that's your source sheet for today. And now I'll screen share it for you. Okay, so this, I'm just going to repeat a little bit of what I just said, which is that one may not, I don't know. Maybe I mistranslated it. One may not buy servants. That's annoying me. I'm just going to change it. One may not buy servants, land, or an unclean beast, meaning one you couldn't eat, with shvi'it money. So the stuff grows from the land, you can sell it, and after the sabbatical year, you sell it, you take that money, you can't now use it to buy other things. That's forbidden. If you did though, and this is an interesting rabbinic formulation, you can't do it, but if you did do it, then you should sell that stuff that you bought and then purchase food with it so that the money goes towards food. Okay, it's just it's a bit of a loophole, which is that you shouldn't use this sabbatical produce for money, but there's a plan B if you did. Okay, basic law there. And there are 3 other kind of iterations of that principle. So one may not bring the bird offerings of a zav or a zava. That's like a male or a female that has genital discharge. That's considered an impurity. And so you bring it's a little impurity. So you bring a little offering, a bird offering. But you can't use the money from Shvi'it to do that. Or if a woman after childbirth with Shvi'it money, a woman who's gone through childbirth offers an offering of Thanksgiving, you can't do that with Shvi'it money either. Remember, after all, you have to consume Shvi'it money. Shvi'it produce. If you did though, same thing here, one must sell it and buy food to eat for their equivalent. And then finally, and this I've already basically said, one may not anoint vessels with oil of 7th year produce. And that's the leather on your seat or on your shoe, or you can use oil. It's sort of like it's like a eating and drinking, primary categories, but they add oil. You can use oil, but you have to use it on your body. Your body has to actually benefit from it, consume it in a way, but you can't use it to oil your chair, okay? But if you did, and here's where this is just where the law stands when this conversation we're about to look at begins. But if you did, you should sell the oil, the thing you oiled up, and use the money to buy food to eat or to consume it in that way. Okay? That I just dumped a whole mess of laws on you and haven't heard from you at all yet. Soon we're gonna see this next piece and then open it up. But is anyone confused or have questions, or is there anything that needs clarifying so far? Okay, here we go. That's Mishnah 8:8, meaning it's deep in the Masechet, the 8th Perek and the 8th Mishnah. And then on the 9th, we get this teaching from Rabbi Eliezer, which is already noticeable, but it's what happens after. So he says a hide, or some kind of leather, oil, or here, a hide, which they oiled with 7th year oil. Oh, that's forbidden. Rabbi Eliezer says it must be burnt. Burn that. But the sages say he must sell it and buy food to eat for its equivalent. Well, we know that. We saw that just up here, right? If you do this, you sell it and buy food to eat their equivalent. But Rabbi Eliezer says it must be burnt. Now, this is a little bit of an unfair question, but anyone have a sense of what Rabbi Eliezer's point is? Where is he coming from? I mean, yeah, I don't expect answers here, but does anyone feel like, oh, that's significant? The sages say you sell it, and Rabbi Eliezer says you burn it. What do we see from Rabbi Eliezer's position, Yonatan?
I think he's afraid that there will be some back door to profit, right? That someone might say, oh, I may as well, oil this thing, and then I'll sell it and figure out some way to benefit from the Shvi'it produce that they're not supposed to.
Great.
And if you tell them to burn it, you remove that avenue.
That's a really interesting theory, and good. And then the law would make sense. The burning it is get rid of this thing. Stop it here. Don't get into the mechanism of loopholes and figuring out your way around it. And Yonatan is saying potentially because there's some worry that once you're in that muck, then you'll start actually trying to profit off the law. And this is important. We'll take one more interpretation. This is important because what Yonatan is suggesting is that Rabbi Eliezer is more strict about this. That's obvious, maybe burning instead of selling, but not just more strict, very worried that this law will be disregarded, disrespected, perhaps even cheated on, so to speak. Alexandra, you want to add anything to that?
I think listening to this, I was thinking this is a very beautiful practice of every 7 years, like really, really deepening your faith in God, that God is providing. And it's not us as people who do work, it's like God providing us through our actions, but it's just such a beautiful exercise in faith. And to develop and maintain that faith muscle, like every 7 years I just think it's amazing in what that must do if people really live that. So perhaps that, I love Jonathan's point, and I'm wondering if maybe also it has his understanding of it had to do with this Rabbi Eliezer. I think if it was that if people sell it, if you start finding these loopholes, it erodes this practice of faith in God.
Great,
providing.
I love that. I love your addition there. That's also, I think, lurking behind this, and Alexander puts it so well, is a kind of a faith, an act of faith. The whole Shvit institution requires you to believe that God will provide, and if you're like sneaking your way around it, right? if you're gaming the system, that may speak to something more than just not following the law. It may say that you're not taking this seriously. You don't really believe that God provides. You don't really believe that the land is God's. You just don't you don't really believe. You have to have faith. And I think that also might be part of Rabbi Eliezer's concern here. Okay, good. We don't know for sure, but we have that debate. Rabbi Eliezer says, burn those things if you use the oil of the seventh year. And the sages, remember, said, no, just sell it and use the money. And then we get this strange snippet of conversation. The students in the Beit Midrash, right? You can really feel you're there in the learning center, and it says, Amru lifnei Rabbi Akiva. The students came before Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, who was a student of Rabbi Eliezer's. We'll soon see that, but you need to know that here. They came before Rabbi Akiva and they said, Rabbi Eliezer used to say, a hide which they smeared with seventh year oil must be burnt. Okay, yeah, we just learned that. Okay? So this is a story that they come forth and they say, whoa, I just heard a teaching from Rabbi Eliezer, and I heard, even though you all are teaching me that you can sell it and use the money to buy food, Rabbi Eliezer, I once heard, said that, or we have heard here in the Beit Midrash, said that you should actually burn it. And then here comes the response. Amar lahem shtoku, lo amar lachem masha Rabbi Eliezer omer bo. He said, silence, shtoku, be quiet. I won't tell you what Rabbi Eliezer actually said on this matter. I won't tell you what Rabbi Eliezer actually said on this matter. Anyone got a read on it? So okay. I think I might just give you the next Mishnah, just so we have, because the same basic thing happens here, but just now that the Mishnah has put this out there, and I'm going to ask you to try and figure out what the heck is going on. They give us another example, and the other example is not related to Shvit, but is the same pattern. It's an even weirder statement of Rabbi Eliezer. This is the next Mishnah. And the Mishnah, that's one of the things we learn about the Mishnah, is willing to go on a tangent. Like, oh, right, well, if you're going to tell that story, I got to tell you this one too. They also came to Rabbi Akiva and said that Rabbi Eliezer used to say, again, just a teaching we heard from Rabbi Eliezer, whoever eats bread baked by Samaritans is like one who eats the flesh of a pig. He replied, silence. I won't tell you what Rabbi Eliezer actually said on this matter. Twice. Same dynamic there. Now, just to explain the Samaritans thing, the Samaritans are people in the north who converted to Judaism, but their conversions were suspect. It seemed maybe they were fleeing from danger and wanted to convert. So there was some question as to whether their Jewish practice was legit, and the rabbis were suspicious of them. And so if there was a rabbinic decree not to eat their bread, it wouldn't be kosher. Rabbi Eliezer apparently said, and if you do, it's like you ate a pig. That's a heavy thing to say. I mean, that's like the Torah forbids eating pig. This is just like rabbis worried about something made a little regulation. And they said that, I heard this from Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Akiva says, shh, no more talking about this. I'm not even going to tell you what Rabbi Eliezer said. Now, what's going on? What's going on? I mean, if you read through, we're going to probe a little bit forward, but we don't have any clear answers. So let's offer some theories. What do you just hear in this conversation? I see Peter hears something.
Well, one thing, it seems both of these examples are about food and people wanting to eat food. And so if they need food, if they're starving, we don't know what the surroundings were, but if someone was obviously considering breaking a law in order to eat food, the rabbi's not going to say, stick to this formalistic prohibition on, well, you have to burn something or you can't eat this if you're starving. So I think there's a kind of formalist, realist dialectic going on there. It's how strict are you going to be when someone really needs something to eat?
Great. Okay, that's a nice read there, because I think I want to just say the core of what Peter is saying, just sort of the legal theory behind it, is that the rabbis are being more pragmatic, more realistic, they're giving you a way of, if you messed up, getting around the law. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer is being, in a sense, formalist. No, that's not the law. You can't just buy back and that you're not allowed to consume this. And Peter adds, and I think compellingly, that these are all things, it's about consuming. And maybe Rabbi Eliezer is worried that people are much more likely to bend or break the laws when they desire something. That's one way of putting it. Peter put it the other way, which is that maybe people need to bend or break the laws when they're hungry. We're talking about bread here. So that's interesting. Okay, Esra.
I have two questions. One is, I'm wondering where you're getting the word actually, because when I read the Hebrew, I don't see it's like implied. And so if it's not read, I won't tell you what he actually said. That implies something else that maybe you know about the relationship between Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer, because that's where my mind goes. What is the relationship between the mentor and the mentee, and the kind of respect maybe Rabbi Akiva wants to give Rabbi Eliezer, but what happens when his own students come forth? Is he saying, like, is he trying to protect him? Like, I'm not going to tell you what he actually said, because what he actually said is like so far from like my stance on things, but out of respect, I'm not. Or is it like, I won't tell you what he said, like, I'm not going to repeat that. That's not how I view things. I'm just, I'm just really curious about the relationship between.
You've convinced me, Esra. I'm deleting that word. That is, you're right. It's my translation, but the translation presumes there is a secret lurking behind. And you're right, that's not actually in the Hebrew. Better without it. Agreed. That maybe, in other words, Esra's saying that it isn't, oh, wait till I tell you, but get away from me. I'm not going to talk to you about what Rabbi Eliezer said. Rabbi Eliezer was one of the great rabbis of the previous generation. He doesn't come with me and be like, I heard he said this salacious thing. Get out of here. And I think that's a good read too. Payam in Pee-wee's Playhouse.
Yeah, I agree with her. I mean, I think he's trying to protect his rabbi, and I think it's like it's shorthand almost, and like, yeah, he said some crazy stuff, but like you have to put it in the context. And like, if you actually read everything he did and you spent as much time as I did with him, then like, this is how he is. And like, so, it's like a context thing. I think especially in our modern society, we're very much used to people taking things out of context in a way. So, he's really, and especially honor, such a big thing for him, especially his teacher. I think he's just trying to protect him in essence.
That's great. There's a kind of, you're trying to take this apart, but this is my teacher, and it isn't just some like flimsy argument. What you're saying reminds me of Maimonides' commentary on this piece, where he says that Maimonides, who himself was a bit of an elitist, says that essentially Rabbi Akiva was saying, you wouldn't even understand Rabbi Eliezer's logic if I gave it to you. Are you kidding me? You think, oh, Rabbi Eliezer was really machmir on this, was really strict on this. It's like, get out of here. Rabbi Eliezer had a whole complicated, I'm not even gonna get into that, all right? Okay, let's take a couple more reads, and then we'll start to see if there are any reads available to us in the Talmud itself. Yonatan.
I'm going to bust your chops a little bit about Samaritans. You spoke about them in the past tense. There are still Samaritans. They're a group that still exists. Although the Pharisees do describe certain origin stories to them that have to do with conversions, that is not how they see themselves, right? They see themselves as descended of I think it's the tribe of Menashe or something like that. And so I just wanted to put that into the room, that they have their own version of their history too.
Yeah, but that one's wrong. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I just think, it's important to be careful when discussing groups that are still living, existing cultures.
Right. And listen, it didn't mean any slur on the Samaritans, but the rabbis did. But yeah, go ahead.
That was it. That was the whole thing.
That's it. Okay, thanks for the clarification. Much appreciated. Yes, indeed. There's politics here, and yeah, there's a whole history. And Jonathan's right to put things in context. I'm not so great at historical context. Jamie?
This has got me thinking about, just openly, generally, about something like executive privilege or state secrets or a Chelsea Manning type situation. Like, what, in a religious context, does it make sense for people in power to have secrets that the people don't get or don't have access to?
Yeah, that's really
how does that play out? What does that mean? What does that mean for our religion? I'm just circling around that.
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. Let's keep that in the mix, right? Are there things that actually you're not supposed to know? Are there things that are the state secrets? Okay, let's, what we would do normally in this case with this such a cryptic interchange in the Mishnah. It's unusual to have it in the Mishnah, and then it gets kind of repeated, and then it's just left there. So usually we would turn to the Talmud. Now the problem is, this is just a bit of like, good FYI info, is there's no Talmud on Tractate Shvi'it. At least there's no Babylonian Talmud. There is a Jerusalem Talmud on Masechet Shvi'it. Now, you may not have heard that there are two Talmuds, and the by far more famous and more studied Talmud is the Babylonian Talmud, which was written in Babylon, in the schools that were outside of the land of Israel, or at least like collects the teachings of those schools. The Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, is smaller and maybe less classically Talmudically interesting, wild kind of stories popping up here. It's not as studied in part just because of this less fun read, but it is the teachings of the sages of that remained and lived in the land of Israel. And think for a second, why would we have a Jerusalem Talmud on the agricultural tractates of the Talmud, but we wouldn't have a Babylonian Talmud? So I see some people starting to nod in understanding, right?
The laws weren't relevant in Bavel.
Exactly. If you're living in Babylon, then the agricultural laws of the Torah don't apply because they apply to the land of Israel. Okay, so interesting. Like in this case, we just have a whole tractates of the Talmud that are not covered by the Babylonian Talmud, and so we can turn to the Jerusalem Talmud, the less studied Talmud, and here's a little piece of that. As a couple of rabbis try to pick up this thread of conversation, and I think speculate, or perhaps like they also have some secret knowledge. They're offering us some secret knowledge, but we're going to see them try to give us a kind of a backstory on this, these things that Rabbi Eliezer said. So a hide which they oiled, right? So this is just a quote here. They're quoting a hide which they oiled from the Mishnah. Okay, so now we're in the Jerusalem Talmud, and the Talmud often works this way. There's a little quote like, "Oh, we're going to explain this." Ma amar bo Rabbi Eliezer. So what did Rabbi Eliezer say? Right. According to Rabbi Yossi, he said, "May the bones of that man be burned." The bones of that atzmotav shaloto ish yisrafu. Okay, But Rabbi Chizkiah, in the name of Rabbi Acha, said he actually permitted this. Okay, let's just like review that. Okay, one position is that Rabbi Eliezer, I won't tell you what he actually said. This is the actually, right, that Esra deleted for us. I won't tell you what he actually said. You think you're so worried that he said burn the hide? He said burn the guy. Burn him. Wow. Okay, and then the other position is that I don't know which one is crazier, because the other position is, nah, he didn't say that. He was like, it's fine. He actually said you can do that. He's the more lenient position. I don't know. What do I say? I mean, I'm curious what you think about these two positions, but I guess to kind of to get our way into it, I'll ask, do you find one of these interpretations more plausible than the other? Which of these readings sounds more convincing, that Rabbi Eliezer said something that was actually so much more fierce that it was offensive? Or is it more likely that actually Rabbi Eliezer had some wild opinion where he just didn't care at all? You could do whatever you want. That's like totally different reads. Okay, yeah, Elle, what do you think?
Well, one thing that I'm really resonating to is that this oil doesn't just seep out of trees. You have to pick the olives, you have to process the olives. So he's got his team of people out there picking the olives during the Shemitah year. It's a very, very serious offense. So it's really serious, and it required a lot of planning. It wasn't accidental. Yeah. And so I can justify an extreme response to that. Okay, so this builds on some of the first Yonatan's and Alexandra's. Like, this is a person trying to game the system, and the system they're trying to game, it's so devious. They're so directly in violation with a commandment that is essentially, it's a Torah commandment that you must not touch this land, for it is God's. And you're like starting to, like, you deserve to die. And now, I don't know if Rabbi Eliezer meant that as like rhetoric or law. It doesn't sound like his position on this was that person should be executed. It doesn't sound exactly like that. It sounds a little bit more like he was like, oh, those bastards, burn them. But that anyway, let's not talk about what he actually said. Okay, but other opinions. What do you think? I think I saw Yael. Let's see. No, it wasn't Yael. Somebody else had their hand up. I just Yael. I thought I saw another hand. Okay, Esra.
Okay, just since no one else had another thing, I'm just wondering. Right. You know, I'd love to know more about Rabbi Eliezer. It's been a while since I've looked at Mishnah or Talmud, so now I'm like, can you catch us up to date? Like, who is this person? Is this a game of telephone? And also, why we're also animated about him and what he said. Anyway, I'm sitting here kind of in shock too. That's pretty extreme. Yeah. So okay, can you tell me more about this guy?
You were just like, I want to shake your hand, you're my friend, and it's like you're transitioning us right to where we need to go. Like, that's right. We're going to now hear the backstory of Rabbi Eliezer, and that's, when you read this, it's such a strange snippet of conversation just in itself, and now the speculation of how extreme it might have been. Yeah, like, what is going on here? Who are these characters? What does Rabbi Eliezer mean to these rabbis? What does Rabbi Eliezer mean to Rabbi Akiva? And Esra pivots us right into that conversation. But before we do, I just want to give you the, remember, there was another place where Rabbi Eliezer opinion couldn't be spoken, and Rabbi Yossi and Chizkiah have opinions on that too. So this will just continue to inform our sense of the debate over what was Rabbi Eliezer's positions, and why are they being concealed? So they also came to Rabbi Akiva and said, and what did they say there? The eating of bread baked by Samaritans is like one who eats the flesh of a pig, right? You can already hear, by the way, in this one, like, this sounds like it could be a law. It must be burnt. But this doesn't sound like it's not a law at all. It's just rage. It's just disdain, right? And so you can start to hear the disdain that is remembered in Rabbi Eliezer's name. Okay. So now, what does Rabbi Yossi say that Rabbi Eliezer actually said about the bread of Samaritans? What he actually said is that it's forbidden to marry the daughter of an ignorant Jew, an am haaretz. We saw this this term a couple of weeks ago. That was the rabbi's term for someone who just didn't know the law. Where is this? Sorry, I lost it. Someone who didn't know the law, an am haaretz. Okay, so you understand the position here? The position is, you think Rabbi Eliezer was suspicious of Samaritans? Rabbi Eliezer told people not to marry Jews when they weren't trustworthy. It's not the trustworthy conversion of the Samaritans. He was more extreme. He didn't want to associate with the ignorant among our people, right? And then the other opinion is, not going to be surprised, Rabbi Chizkiah, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, said, no, Rabbi Eliezer would permit the eating of the chametz of Samaritans immediately after Passover. Not only would he let you eat their bread, but he wouldn't even be worried that they hadn't kept Passover well. He would let you eat their bread right after Passover. So again, one opinion is that he actually said his real position was so offensive you wouldn't want to hear it. And the other opinion is, no, actually Rabbi Eliezer, who's like, we have remembered as this kind of machmir, strict opinion, is actually he didn't care about this stuff at all. It's like, what? All right, we're gonna go into Esther's, where Esther was leading us into the backstory of Rabbi Eliezer, but I see a couple of hands up. Either you want to speak to what we've seen so far, Yonatan or Alexandra? Yes, Alexandra.
To me, I find it all very funny and entertaining. Like and I think Israel's question is really important, but and I want to know the answer. But to me, what it sounds like so far is that Rabbi Akiva is the only one who's had any sense so far in my mind, because he's the one who's saying, you guys are getting so lost in the tiny, like, little minutia of this that you're losing all sense of God, all sense of holiness, all sense of spirituality. And the rabbi, and I'm not even going to get into it with you because you need to think about that. I can't just give it to you. You have to get there through a path of questioning. And these other rabbis who are like, well, this is what he meant, seem like they're doing the exact same thing as Rabbi Akiva's students. So I'm finding it very funny and amusing, and I think Rabbi Akiva has the most sense, but they don't have the sense to recognize it. That's how I'm reading it at this point. It may change.
Yeah, I think that's a great read, and I think it is possible to see this as a conversation about gossip and slander and speculation and rumors and just the building of stories. And maybe Rabbi Akiva is saying this is not what we do in a Beit Midrash. I heard Rabbi Eliezer said, no, I'm not going to talk about what Rabbi Eliezer said and the backstory and what he was thinking beforehand. It's no, there are laws. It's stop this nonsense. I think that's also a read. Yonatan?
Now, there's a chance this may be where you're going with this, but I think Rabbi Akiva is mostly worried that Rabbi Eliezer is right. And that's why he's not sharing his opinion. Right, Rabbi Eliezer had this tendency to disagree with everyone else and always be right, and it didn't get him anywhere. And in this case, if he's disagreeing with all of the other rabbis about these particular laws, and I think that the concern really is we're not prepared to live according to his ruling.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is Esra posed the question, Yonatan begins to tease us with the answer. And that's right. Let's take a look now, because Yonatan is probably aware, and some of you are also probably thinking, you read this story, start thinking about it, and then you remember, wait, who was Rabbi Eliezer? Who was this guy? And it suddenly occurs to you, if you've seen it before, that the most famous story about Rabbi Eliezer feels very relevant here. And it's one of the most famous stories in the Talmud. usually, I mean, I actually got tired of teaching it at a certain point. The Oven of Ahne. I stopped teaching it because it was a little bit like, you play the band plays the same song, it's like enough already, I got tired of it because it's so central to understanding rabbinic jurisprudence and theology. This Oven of Ahne, because of the great declaration in the middle, what Rabbi Yoshua says, which is Lo b'shamayim hi. The law is not in the heavens, it's in our hands. Maybe you've heard that, it's not in the heavens. Okay, so we're gonna read the story, and we're not gonna take an hour to discuss it. We're just gonna read it as back story, but it will be important, and I think Yonatan is right to begin to suggest it tells us a lot about who Rabbi Eliezer was and how he was always right and how it didn't work out so well for him. So in this period, the previous generation, there were three major rabbis. There was Rabbi Gamliel, who was the nasi, the head, the president, and made all kinds of policies that were difficult for some people, but was sort of in charge. There was Rabbi Yehoshua, who was considered one of the great sages of the generation, but sometimes was in conflict with Rabbi Gamliel. And then there was Rabbi Eliezer, who was considered the great genius of the generation and had his own school, but also was sometimes in conflict with both Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Gamliel in particular. Okay, and so Rabbi Gamliel was a very political figure and started to marshal his power to kind of block all of Rabbi Eliezer's opinions, because Rabbi Eliezer was known as a very strict ruler. All of his opinions were very strict. However, the case we're going to look at is an opinion where Rabbi Eliezer actually has the lenient view, and nevertheless, under the leadership of Rabbi Gamliel, the sages came in and blocked his opinion, and that is the Oven of Ahne. So we're going to read through it here, and I hope my translation is okay. I kind of like I said, this is the first time I've taught this, so I sort of slapped together, copied and pasted some things. So this is the law, and this is the famous case of the Oven of Ahne. We're going to read it relatively quickly, but our job will be to try and see if this informs our sense of who Rabbi Eliezer was and why his opinions might be safeguarded. So it was taught, if one sliced an oven into separate tiles, okay, so you have a portable oven. So if you have a portable, put together oven, you put sand between each tile, Rabbi Eliezer declared it clean and the sages declared it unclean. Now, we don't need to understand that too well. I'll just say that for something to be able to receive tuma, impurity, it needs to be a full vessel. And so maybe if it's broken up into pieces, it can't. Okay, and this was the Oven of Ahne. They called this the Oven of Ahne. Why Ahne? Actually, the answer doesn't seem like it's really the right answer, but said Rabbi Yehuda in Samuel's name, they wrapped it with arguments like a snake, an Ahne, and proved it unclean. Probably someone named Ahne owned this oven, but whatever. Okay, so this is the story. It has been taught. All right, so Rabbi Eliezer said it's clean, they said it's unclean, and Rabbi Eliezer said, what are you kidding me? You're going to block me even when I have a lenient opinion? So he brought forth every imaginable argument, but they did not accept them. And then it starts getting crazy. He said to them, if the law agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. And then the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place. Okay, so things are starting to get supernatural. In other words, he's exasperated and he's saying, I will start just sort of ripping trees out of the ground with my mind, telekinesis here. And it works. He has that power. But they say no proof can be brought from a carob tree. It's a little bit of a funny answer. You can't prove your argument by ripping trees out of the ground. Again, he said to them, if the law agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. The stream of water then began to flow backwards. No proof can be brought from a stream of water. They rejoined. This is not my translation, so forgive the language here. Again, he urged, if the law agrees with me, let the walls of the Beit Midrash prove it. Whereupon the walls began to fall down. Now, there are people presumably in the Beit Midrash. He's destroying buildings. He's endangering lives potentially here. But Rabbi Joshua rebuked them, the walls, and said, when scholars are engaged in a legal dispute, what have you to interfere? Stop falling, walls. Hence, they did not fall in honor of Rabbi Yoshua, but they didn't stand upright again in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing like this today, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? And they are still standing like this today. Again, he said to them, if the law agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. And this is really the grand moment. And a bat kol, a heavenly voice cried out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the law agrees with him? In other words, God is telling you that Rabbi Eliezer is always right. That happened in this story, but Rabbi Joshua, and this is the climax, arose and exclaimed, in the Torah it says, lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in heaven. What did he mean by this? Said Rabbi Yirmiyah, because the Torah's already been given at Mount Sinai, we don't pay attention to a heavenly voice. God can't interfere with our legal discussions, because after all, you said at Mount Sinai in your Torah, you have to go by the majority. So let us decide. Okay, I'm racing through what is this classic piece, but it ends in this really charming way, which is that Rabbi Natan happened upon Elijah and asked him, what did God do when all this happened? And Elijah said, he laughed and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Ha ha ha. You are all so clever down there. Okay? And this is often taught as, this is rabbinic jurisprudence. The Torah is ours. We do with it what we will. Even as we revere the Torah, we're able to subvert the Torah. Our power is greater than God's in some ways. Okay, that's the story. But I must just continue, and it's usually we stop teaching there, but I must just continue and show you what Rabbi Eliezer's response was, because it sounds like it ends, yay, my children have defeated me, but they say on that day that the sages brought all the ritually pure items deemed pure by the ruling of Eliezer with regard to the oven and burned them in the fire. Anything he said was clean, they burned, and then they excommunicated him. They excommunicated him. That's one of the great sages of the generation. And presumably because he endangered life, right? Like that he got out of control, but also because his opinions are dangerous. Okay. And then they said, there's a typo here, and then they said, and they said, who will go and inform him? Rabbi Akiva said to them, I will go, lest an unseemly person go, and he would thereby destroy the whole world. Like if someone goes and offends him, it's over. This is like Dr. Manhattan. This is like, this guy is all powerful. Be careful. If someone offends him, he'll destroy the whole world. So what did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black and wrapped himself in black and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits. Why? Because he's excommunicated, and you're not allowed to get within 4 cubits of someone who's been excommunicated. So Rabbi Eliezer looks at him and says, Akiva, what's different about today from other days? A little play on Passover there. Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. Very subtle way of saying you're out. So Rabbi Eliezer too tore his garments and removed his shoes, and he dropped from his seat and sat upon the ground. His eyes shed tears, and as a result, the entire world was afflicted. When Eliezer is upset, the world feels it. 1/3 of its olives and 1/3 of its wheat and 1/3 of its barley was just destroyed. And some say even dough kneaded in a woman's hands while that was happening was spoiled. The sages taught there was great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned. Okay, I think you can hear, and unfortunately we don't have a ton of time, and a lot of this is just to bring us to this point, but I think you can hear that there's a lot in this story that feels very relevant to this dynamic that we've been exploring, right? And need I point out, there was some imagery here, like imagery of burning, right? And imagery of, as Yonatan said, of Rabbi Eliezer not being celebrated, Rabbi Eliezer not being recorded, Rabbi Eliezer not being included because his position was different. Okay, so it's a little unfair to do this to you, just read a huge story that's one of the classics of Jewish tradition, but today we're just using it to inform our earlier our earlier investigation of this dynamic that now exists in the Beit Midrash. Imagine this has happened. And then in the Beit Midrash, they say, yeah, I don't want to talk about Rabbi Akiva, who was the person who had to go and tell Rabbi Eliezer, you're excommunicated. And now it's a different, there's a different sort of tone that we could hear in Rabbi Akiva's voice when he says, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk about Rabbi Eliezer, right? There's a lot of history there. Okay, so anyone wanna, like I said, it's not a fair, so what do you think about all of that? But does anyone want to try and begin to make some connections? How does this story inform our understanding of our Mishnah? Hannah?
I don't know. I just have a lot of feelings about it. But I think that what really struck me at the beginning is that so much of the time, the opposite thing happens. You always quote your teacher. It's an honor to say B'Shem Amra, B'Shem Amra. You say it in the name of the person who said it to you. So then you'd think that Akiva would really want to give honor to his teacher, and they ask him a question. They bring up something about Eliezer, and he wants to give him the credit for that. But then you kind of see in the story that I wonder about what happens when the people you revere or you honor fall short, or they make some really critical mistakes, or they do things you can't abide anymore. And they're still your teacher and you're still associated with them, or they're still your friend or your family or whoever. What happens when you're in a situation where what's expected of you generally is to honor and revere that person and give them credit and bring their name into all of these spaces and conversations, but you can't in good conscience do it anymore? And so how do you separate yourself enough from them that you don't get kind of sullied in the same way, but also not get swept up in also tearing them down? How do you give yourself that space? So maybe the space you have to create is to say, I'm not going to talk about that, because it's a slippery slope either way. If I talk about it and I revere it and I honor it, which I've been told to do about my teachers, I can't do that in good conscience. But if instead I get riled up with you in tearing him down and in saying that he's a terrible person, I can't do that either, because at the end of the day, he was still my teacher. He's still my people. He's still close to my heart. And I can't forget the rest of the things I learned from him and gained from him. And so my only option is to remove myself.
Yeah. Very well put. Very well put there. And part of what you've done, Hannah, has made it feel very relevant, right? Because these are, people who are disgraced or that we, that have done things that suddenly shift their, that feels like a today conversation. Like, what do we do with our teachers who aren't, or our artists, or the people that we love and then find to be, okay, so that's a read. And I think you nicely suggest that there are tensions on both sides. It's not like, how do I distance myself? It's like, I don't, All right, let's take one more comment, and then I want to show you one last story that will help kind of inform our, did I see Ken raise his hand?
Sort of like many of the patriarchs. They all have some aspect of their behavior or the psychology that we find questionable today.
Yeah, imagine that the conversation was like, I heard that Abraham wanted to kill his son and didn't even hesitate. Is that true? Right? And you're like, stop talking about Abraham. What do you know about Abraham? What do you know what it was like to be there? Get out of here. Okay, yeah, that was pretty weird. But I don't want to talk, I don't want to defame our patriarch. Give me a break. What do you understand about the binding of Isaac? What do you understand about what it's like to be in contact with God? Because after all, Rabbi Eliezer is in contact with God. The story tells us that though he's chaotic and excommunicated and it's disastrous, and he was right, and God Almighty came down and said, yes, you Rabbi Eliezer, you are all wrong. And somehow it was too much though. It's too much. And maybe precisely because he could summon the heavens, that also makes it Maybe that's part of the problem. You can have someone around here who's just like, yeah, I'm right, and if you disagree with me, I'll rip trees out of the ground, right? Okay, so that's this story. It's so relevant. I mean, I think we could continue to move through who was Rabbi Eliezer and what does that mean for this snippet of a conversation. But I want to give you one other story, the story of, after all of that, Rabbi Eliezer on his deathbed. And again, Rabbi Akiva will feature prominently. So we'll end with this. Take a look at this. This is from the tractate Sanhedrin. And when Rabbi Eliezer finally, after that excommunication, finally took ill, became sick, Rabbi Akiva, and in part because he was so depressed, became sick, Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues came to visit him. He was sitting on his bed and they were sitting in his waiting room. It was the Sabbath, and Hyrcanus is Eliezer's son, entered to remove his tefillin, because you don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. And apparently he's lying in his deathbed, he wore tefillin all day long, but it's Shabbat. But his father berated him and he left reprimanded. Hyrcanus said to his father's colleagues, "It appears to me that my father went insane," meaning he doesn't get anymore that it's Shabbat. I was trying to take his tefillin off before Shabbat, but he didn't get it. But Rabbi Eliezer overheard him say this and said, he, Hyrcanus, and his mother went insane. Because how can they neglect Shabbat preparations, which are Shabbat, which has to be prepared, or else you'll be punished by stoning, because Shabbat is a biblical commandment, such as lighting the candles, preparing hot food, and engaging in preparations. So they should do all of that and not be worried about whether I have my tefillin on. Sorry, this translation's not mine, so it's a little clumsy. And engage in preparations concerning prohibitions by rabbinic degree, such as wearing phylacteries on Shabbat. Sorry, that's bad translation, but but Eliezer shows he actually does get what's going on. Okay, he hasn't gone insane, he isn't enfeebled, and in fact, he's his old fierce self. What are you worrying about my tefillin? Well, you should be getting ready for Shabbat. Shabbat comes from God. Tefillin's just like a stupid thing that the rabbis decided. Okay. Since the sages perceived from this retort that his mind was stable, they entered and sat before him at a distance of 4 cubits. Why? Because he's still excommunicated. They said to him, "We've come to study Torah." He said to them, "And why have you not come until now?" Think about that moment. They said to him, "We did not have spare time." He said to them, "I would be surprised if these die their own death." Whoa. What he's saying is, none of you is going to die naturally. I don't know, is that a curse or is that prophecy? And Rabbi Akiva said to him, "How will mine be?" And he said to him, "Yours will be worse than theirs." And that is true. Rabbi Akiva was skinned alive. And all of this he's telling them this on their deathbed. Rabbi Eliezer then raised his 2 arms and placed them on his heart. And he said, "Woe to you, my 2 arms, as they are like 2 Torah scrolls that are now being rolled up and will never be opened again. I have learned much Torah, and I have taught much Torah. I have learned much Torah, and I have not taken enough away from my teachers like a dog laughing from the sea. I have taught much Torah, but my students have taken away from me only like a paintbrush from a tube of paint." And then he dies. And after Shabbat, Rabbi Akiva sees that his funeral procession is moving by, and it says, after the Sabbath, Rabbi Akiva came and found Rabbi Eliezer being taken in a coffin from Caesarea to Lod. Immediately he tore his clothes, pulled at his hair until blood began to come out and drip on the ground. And he screamed and cried, and he said, "Woe is me, my master, for I have lost you. Woe is me, my master, for I have lost you. My master, you have left this whole generation like an orphan." And at the head of the funeral line, he said, and he quotes the Elisha seeing his master Elijah being taken into a cloud. He said, my father, the chariot of Israel and all its horsemen. You have left money for me, and I have no table, no money changer to exchange them." So that is part of what we need to know when we hear Rabbi Akiva saying, "I don't want to talk about it." And I don't know what Rabbi Akiva doesn't want to talk about. And I don't know exactly how he felt about Rabbi Eliezer at the end. And I don't know what Rabbi Eliezer really represents in the tradition. But Rabbi Akiva was the one who sat at Rabbi Eliezer's deathbed to try and create some kind of reconciliation, and was told that it was too late. And it was too late for him, for Rabbi Eliezer was the one who told him how he would die. And that night, he ran after Rabbi Eliezer's coffin and said, we've all lost something great here. Like a generation that's been orphaned. So when the students scurry up to Rabbi Akiva and they say, well, didn't he teach some weird thing though? Isn't there some story about he tore the walls down of the Beit Midrash? Isn't that Rabbi Eliezer? What was going on in that generation? Rabbi Akiva just says, silence. Shtok, you have no idea what we went through losing this man. So we'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody. See you Wednesday night. We'll have class for Thanksgiving, 6 p.m.
Thank you, Rabbi Kasher.
Great learning with you.